One of the most common struggles I hear from my students is that they feel like taking notes doesn't actually help them learn anything or remember what they've learned. But PhDs take notes in a fundamentally different way. Back when I attended both my undergrad and then Columbia University, I started to implement 3 note-taking strategies that several master's and PhD students around me were using. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use these 3 approaches together as a system to help you learn more deeply, retain what you learn, and ultimately master your field. Starting with the first approach: thinking on paper. You see, back when I was in my undergrad, I had one professor who was and still is a prolifically published PhD in philosophy. And I would regularly go into his office and have a casual chat with him, and often some very deep ones. And I always noticed something striking about all the books piled around him, namely that their pages were covered with sticky notes. And it wasn't long before I started to realize exactly what he was doing and why it was so effective. In short, these sticky notes were all about idea incubation. And so from then on, I copied this same approach. Whenever I read books, I would dress them up with all sorts of sticky notes, take notes on those sticky notes as I read, and I started not simply to take notes, but instead to actually think on paper. Or in other words, I started using writing not simply to summarize the main points, but also to note my own thoughts, opinions, and commentary as I read, just like my PhD professor was doing. In other words, I was using my notes in an important way, not simply for repetition and regurgitation, but instead for synthesis. You see, writing out your notes does have proven brain and learning benefits, but research has shown that this effect becomes even more amplified when you actually write out your own feedback or replies to every point instead of just repeating what the book or the lecturer, if you're in a class setting, has stated. And in fact, using my note-taking as an idea incubator like this is one of the main factors I credit to being able to produce my first academically published book at the age of 23. Because, after all, this book is simply the product of mountains of notes I accumulated, commented on, and reflected on over time. Now, I have an entire video on this concept of thinking on paper and how to do it effectively. And so if you want a deeper dive on this topic, you can check out that video at the video card above. And so instead of elaborating further on this whole concept and process here, instead, let's discuss the actual context in which this kind of note-taking is most effective and the other contexts in which another approach to note-taking would be more effective for you. Which leads us to our second approach to note-taking: typing your notes. You see, there's a big debate out there right now regarding whether taking notes on paper and the use of analog tools is superior to digital methods such as computer note-taking, digital mind mapping, and the use of various apps. And research shows that handwriting notes does seem to be better for learning and retention, but there are a few important cautions. One, the advantage that taking written notes has over taking typed notes, while statistically significant, seems to be small. 2, the context and conditions in which you take notes might increase or decrease this advantage. And 3, your learning goals that you use your notes for might sometimes make digital note-taking a better option. So then, when exactly is it a better option? And how do PhDs utilize it? So if you're reading a book or even simply doing some daily journaling to collect your thoughts, which I highly recommend by the way, handwriting your notes can definitely enhance your processing of the information because it creates what are called deeper memory traces in your brain. However, if you're in a classroom setting or taking a course and it's specifically a lecture style where there's someone in front of the room or on video lecturing to you, then I would definitely go for digital note-taking. And here's why. Remember point 2 I mentioned before? Well, here's where this point starts to matter. When I was at Columbia, pretty much all of my classmates and I took notes on paper. And this was especially useful because I was taking almost exclusively science courses in which I often had to copy diagrams from the board or visually represent certain pieces of information. And that's simply not so easy to do on a laptop. You might be tempted to take a photo of these types of diagrams, but again, you just won't internalize the concepts in the same way as if you had drawn them. Plus, let's be honest, when was the last time you actually reviewed any of those photos you've taken? Yeah, that's what I thought. But in other classes I took, such as psychology or neuroendocrinology, we were either mostly discussing conceptual theory or directly reviewing clinical research studies. And so my priority became the speed at which I could copy the information. And once again, there's good research to show that in situations like these in which you need to collect information rapidly, it's often more helpful to type your notes. And especially in my neuroendocrinology class, the students, who were a mixture of PhD and master's students, also mostly brought their laptops to type their notes. Research shows, however, that typing becomes an advantage in these types of situations if you review them afterward or actually use them in some way. That's why I often tell my students, when you're sitting in a classroom or lecture hall listening to someone teach a lecture, that's not the context in which learning occurs. Instead, that's where exposure to new information occurs. The learning part of this process occurs after the lecture. In 1, the review process, and 2, the synthesis process, as we saw with respect to thinking on paper. So let's dive into these, starting with your review process. Most people have entirely the wrong idea about what review actually is, and I see this mistake among the students I coach one-on-one all the time. After they read something or attend a lecture, they often have volumes of notes they've typed out. And who can blame them? How exactly do they know which notes are most relevant or priority and which ones are less relevant? You see, this problem is precisely why you might feel that your notes aren't very useful or helpful to you. But here's the solution, which is number 2. The synthesis process. One of the single most effective methods for digital note-taking I ever saw when I was at Columbia, especially among the master's and PhD students I spent time with, was the creation of outlines. Very often, students would review not by simply glossing over their notes like most people, but instead they would actively learn and process the information by sifting through their notes and reorganizing them into an outline. And over time, I started to copy this approach. And here's how to do it effectively. Among all your notes, try to find the big idea, the main idea, or what you might even call the thesis. Then identify the top 2 to 3 ideas among your notes that support that thesis. So for instance, if you're learning about Enlightenment era philosophy and you have various notes about rationalism and empiricism, here's an example of how you might organize it all. Let's state your thesis as something like, rationalists and empiricists disagreed over the nature of knowledge and reality. And then as a supporting point, you might write point of disagreement number 1. Innate ideas versus no innate ideas. And then underneath that, list thinkers such as Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, and Hume, Berkeley, and Locke, along with their unique viewpoints on this topic. And maybe as your second supporting point, you'd write point of disagreement number 2. Knowledge from experience versus knowledge from pure logic. And then once again, summarize each thinker's respective ideas underneath this. And do you see how doing this forces you to actively engage with your notes instead of passively sitting in front of them and reciting them, which doesn't actually work anyway? However, once again, context matters, which is precisely why our third approach to note-taking is so important, knowing when to take no notes at all. So remember when I told you that the classroom or lecture hall isn't actually where learning takes place? Well, let's parse that with a bit of nuance. If I think back to my undergrad experience, in which I did the bulk of my studies in ethical theory and value theory, certain classes made the most impact on me precisely because they were not simply lecture-style courses. In fact, I think back to 2 courses in particular, Problems in Metaethics and Problems in Medical Ethics, in which, of course, principles, concepts, and theories were taught, but most importantly, we had to read certain articles each week and come back to the next class prepared to discuss those articles. But here's the thing, we didn't simply discuss them. We were expected to take a position on them, analyze them, think of counter-arguments or counter-examples, and in a sense, politely debate both each other and the professor. In a sense, this was a sort of exercise in critical thinking. And research has shown that when you actively engage your critical thinking like this, you're indeed engaging in deep processing and learning. And so in these situations, although I always took my notebook to class, I took almost no notes. You see, research shows that in learning situations such as these in which you're actively engaging your critical thinking, note-taking can actually hinder learning because it results in what is called light processing of information. And you see, this is what a lot of people don't get about, for instance, the use of learning apps, the creation of mind maps, and so on. While these are all useful and in fact evidence-based tools, yet more research shows that integrating mind mapping and group discussion-based learning tends to yield greater benefits than either method by itself. And why is this? It's because, generally speaking, we can think of note-taking methods in the following way. Note-taking methods such as mind mapping, typing, and the use of apps for storing and categorizing notes are all effective. However, when we add any additional critical thinking-based methods such as thinking on paper, group discussion, or outlining, then it's no longer 1 + 1 = 2, but instead 1 + 1 = 3. There's a combined effect from doing both together that is greater than the sum of the parts. That's why, for instance, when younger students come to me needing help with vocabulary, they all have been taught that they need to build flashcards and lists, and yeah, sure, they do. But this tends to get way overemphasized. Yes, I tell them, build your lists, make your flashcards, but most importantly, read more books, because it's by reading more books, i.e. an activity that engages critical thinking, that they will naturally build their vocabulary. And so how do you currently take notes? How will you now combine different note-taking methods or adjust what you're doing now? I'd love to hear what you're learning or what projects you're working on in the comments. And if you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but also on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.